Walter Dean has spent over a decade proving his skills, but for some, his talent is never enough. A captain who doubts him, a crisis at 30,000 feet, and a fight for recognition. Walter must rise above prejudice and prove that true leadership comes from courage, not skin color. Will he finally earn the respect he deserves? Walter Dean was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, a place where the vast blue sky always stirred grand dreams within him. From a young age, he would spend hours gazing up at airplanes gliding overhead, wondering if, one day, he might sit in the cockpit and command one himself. But dreams were never easy. When Walter set his sights on aviation, he quickly realized that the path ahead was riddled with obstacles. Not just the grueling technical demands, but also the unspoken barriers of his skin color. In an industry where black pilots made up less than 2%, he was constantly forced to prove that he belonged. He spent over a decade in the field, logging thousands of flight hours, yet the captain's seat remained just out of reach. Time and again, he watched colleagues, less experienced, but of a different complexion, rise through the ranks with ease. And yet, Walter never allowed resentment to take root. He believed that skill, and skill alone, would shatter the glass ceiling. Today, Walter was the first officer on Skyway Airlines' LA to Miami flight. Stepping into the pre-flight briefing room, he was hardly surprised to find Captain Matthew Nuths already seated, his gaze cool and unreadable. Matthew Nuths, a veteran pilot with over 25 years of experience, prided himself on his tough, no-nonsense leadership. He had little patience for what he called diversity hiring, and to him, Walter was just another example of that policy in action. Also present was Sonia Grant, the lead flight attendant, a sharp, composed woman with a knack for navigating difficult situations. She had flown with Walter many times and respected his professionalism. She knew he was an exceptional pilot, but she also understood the quiet battle he fought every day just to be seen as equal. The briefing began. Matthew flipped through the flight documents before finally looking up, his expression hard. "Walter, just sit back and let me handle everything. I don't need you turning this flight into a stage for yourself." A brief silence hung in the air. The words were simple, yet laced with something far heavier. Walter had heard such remarks before, but each time, they ignited a familiar, simmering anger within him. He took a slow breath, steadying himself, his voice even as he replied, "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to do my job." From across the room, Sonia watched the exchange, her expression unreadable. She knew exactly what Matthew was doing, undermining Walter, making it clear who held the power. But what struck her more was Walter's response. No outrage, no protest. Just quiet, unshakable certainty. And in that moment, a thought crossed her mind. Perhaps, one day, Walter would prove to them all that he was the most deserving of them all. The cabin speakers crackled to life as Sonia finished the safety briefing. The passengers were settled in, some gazing out the windows, others lost in their phones or chatting quietly with their seatmates. In the cockpit, Matthew went through the final steps of the takeoff checklist, his fingers gliding over the controls with practiced ease. Without looking at Walter, he said flatly, "Check the weather conditions." Walter nodded, his eyes scanning the weather radar. The skies along their route were mostly clear, but there was a wind shear band at 10,000 feet near their flight path. It wasn't a major concern, but it was worth noting. He reported, "Mild wind shear at 10,000 feet. Nothing serious, but we should adjust the takeoff angle slightly to minimize turbulence." Matthew barely reacted. He arched an eyebrow, then flipped to the next page of the checklist without acknowledgement. His silence was its own kind of dismissal. Walter exhaled slowly, reminding himself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time his input had been ignored. A few minutes later, air traffic control cleared them for takeoff. Skyway 227, runway 4L, light winds at 5 knots. Cleared for departure. Skyway 227, copy that. Matthew responded over the radio before pushing the throttles forward. The engines roared to life, and the Boeing 737-900 surged down the runway. Walter kept his eyes locked on the instruments, hands poised over the controls. At 140 knots, Matthew called out, V1, the point of no return. They were committed now. Rotate. Matthew pulled back on the yoke, and the nose of the aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground. The 737 climbed into the open sky. But just as they passed 9,500 feet, Walter felt it, a faint tremor rippling through the aircraft's body. The wind shear he had warned about. Light turbulence, Walter noted, eyes steady on the control panel. Seconds later, a stronger jolt rocked the plane. The cabin rattled. Passengers in the back gripped their armrests. Walter reacted instantly, adjusting the flight surfaces to counteract the turbulence, fine-tuning the pitch to ride through the unstable air. Beside him, Matthew hesitated for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for Walter to notice. Then, with a curt motion, he corrected his grip on the controls, masking the brief lapse. 10 seconds later, the turbulence was gone. The aircraft leveled out smooth and steady once more. Walter glanced at Matthew. Did he realize he had been wrong? Matthew said nothing, his face unreadable as he focused on the instruments. But Walter didn't need an admission. In that fleeting moment, Matthew had seen it, the truth of Walter's skill. Outside, the endless blue sky stretched beyond the horizon, a quiet reminder of the dream Walter had never abandoned. Even now, the road ahead remained steep, but he knew one thing for certain. He belonged here. The cabin speakers crackled to life as Sonia completed the safety briefing. The passengers were settled, some gazing out the windows, others absorbed in their phones or chatting quietly with their seatmates. In the cockpit, Matthew went through the final steps of the takeoff checklist, his fingers moving over the controls with effortless precision. Without looking at Walter, he spoke in a detached tone. Check the weather conditions. Walter nodded, eyes scanning the weather radar. The skies along their route were mostly clear, but a wind shear band lingered at 10,000 feet near their flight path. It wasn't a major threat, but it was worth noting. He reported, light wind shear at 10,000 feet. Nothing concerning, but we should adjust the takeoff angle slightly to minimize turbulence. Matthew barely reacted. He raised an eyebrow, then flipped to the next page of the checklist without acknowledgement. His silence was a statement in itself. Walter exhaled slowly, reminding himself to stay composed. This wasn't the first time his input had been dismissed. Minutes later, air traffic control cleared them for takeoff. Skyway 227, runway 4L, light winds at 5 knots. Cleared for departure. Skyway 227, copy that. Matthew responded through the radio before pushing the throttles forward. The engines roared to life, and the Boeing 737-900 surged down the runway. Walter kept his eyes on the instruments, hands poised over the controls. At 140 knots, Matthew called out, V1, the point of no return. They were committed now. Rotate. Matthew pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft's nose lifted smoothly off the ground. The 737 climbed into the open sky. But just as they passed 9,500 feet, Walter felt it, a faint tremor rippling through the fuselage. The wind shear he had warned about. Light turbulence, Walter noted, eyes locked on the control panel. Seconds later, a stronger jolt shook the plane. The cabin rattled. Passengers in the back gripped their armrests. Walter acted immediately, adjusting the flight surfaces to counter the turbulence, fine-tuning the pitch to ride through the unstable air. Beside him, Matthew hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. Then, with a curt motion, he corrected his grip on the controls, masking the momentary lapse. Within 10 seconds, the turbulence was gone. The aircraft steadied, smooth once more. Walter glanced at Matthew. Did he realize he had been wrong? Matthew said nothing, his face unreadable as he focused on the instruments. But Walter didn't need an admission. In that fleeting moment, Matthew had seen it, the truth of Walter's skill. Beyond the cockpit windows, the sky stretched vast and endless, a quiet testament to the dream Walter had never abandoned, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. Outside the window, the afternoon sunlight gleamed against the aircraft's wing, scattering golden reflections across the endless blue sky. Skyway 227 cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, still 2 hours away from its destination in Miami. In the passenger cabin, everything seemed normal. Sonia Grant made her way down the aisle, offering a warm smile to an elderly couple sipping their coffee. A young boy by the window pressed his face against the glass, mesmerized by the drifting white clouds. In the cockpit, Walter Dean kept a steady eye on the instrument panel, monitoring the flight's progress. Beside him, Matthew Nuths remained as aloof as ever. Everything appeared to be going according to plan, until, without warning, a caution light flickered to life on the control panel. Walter's eyes sharpened. He checked the readings. The cabin pressure was dropping abnormally fast. His brow furrowed. Something was wrong. If the pressure continued to fall, passengers could suffer from oxygen deprivation. A serious threat. Cabin pressure is decreasing, Walter reported, his voice calm but firm. I recommend descending to 10,000 feet for safety. Matthew glanced at the controls, then shrugged. It's just minor turbulence. No need to overreact. Walter's grip on the yoke tightened. He knew better. This wasn't something to ignore. Just then, a chime echoed from the cabin, followed by Sonia's voice over the intercom. We have passengers reporting shortness of breath. This may be related to cabin pressure. Are you seeing anything unusual on your end? Walter turned to Matthew. The situation was escalating. Still, Matthew remained unmoved. We're not dropping altitude just because a few people feel uncomfortable. That'll throw us off schedule. His tone was resolute, unwavering. Walter took a slow, measured breath, forcing himself to stay composed. This wasn't just a technical decision. It was a test, a defining moment of responsibility. If Matthew refused to act, the situation could turn dangerous fast. Walter knew he had to do something. The question was, would Matthew listen? The warning chime echoed through the cockpit again. Walter's eyes locked onto the cabin pressure display. It was still dropping. A thin sheen of sweat formed on his brow. Every second of delay pushed them closer to real danger. Oxygen deprivation. And if the pressure fell much further, the emergency masks would deploy automatically. He couldn't just sit there. Walter turned to Matthew, his voice low but firm. Matthew, we need to descend now. If we don't, we're putting over 180 passengers at risk. Matthew scoffed, his indifference unwavering. I already told you, this isn't serious. If you're worried, just sit tight and let me do my job. Walter narrowed his eyes. This wasn't about personal pride anymore. It was about lives. This isn't a matter of worry, Walter pressed, his gaze never leaving the instruments. It's a matter of safety. We're losing cabin pressure. Matthew folded his arms, leaning back in his seat with a smirk. So what's your grand plan? Drop altitude, panic the passengers, and throw the whole flight into chaos over a minor glitch. Walter clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm. We don't wait for disaster to react, Matthew. I've been flying long enough to know when something needs to be handled now. A sharp chuckle left Matthew's lips, laced with mockery. Have you now? You've been flying long enough? He repeated the last words with pointed amusement. Walter, let's not forget, I have over 25 years in this cockpit. I don't need a junior pilot telling me how to fly my aircraft. Walter's grip tightened, but he refused to take the bait. Experience doesn't make you infallible, Matthew, he said evenly. And if we don't descend now, this situation is going to get a hell of a lot worse. Silence. In the cabin, passengers were growing restless. Some were visibly struggling to breathe. Sonia saw it happening. Her voice cut through the tension over the intercom. Gentlemen, we have a problem. A passenger just lost consciousness. I strongly suggest you reassess the situation. Walter pressed the mic button without hesitation, his voice steady and commanding. Sonia, prepare for an emergency descent. Matthew's head snapped toward him, his stare laced with challenge. Did you just give an order? Walter's expression remained impassive. No, I'm simply doing my job. Their eyes locked. Who would back down first? A few agonizing seconds passed before Matthew exhaled sharply, then muttered through clenched teeth. Fine, But if this backfires, you take the heat. Walter didn't respond. He wrapped his hands around the controls and eased the aircraft into a descent, guiding it steadily toward 10,000 feet. Outside the window, the sky seemed calmer now. But inside the cockpit, the tension still loomed, heavy and unresolved. And one question remained. Would Matthew let this go? The Boeing 737-900 began its descent, gliding steadily into the lower atmosphere. The air inside the cabin gradually stabilized, but the weight of tension still lingered. Walter kept a firm grip on the controls, his eyes locked onto the instrument panel. The altitude numbers ticked downward, 30,000 feet, 25,000, 15,000. In the passenger cabin, the oxygen masks no longer dangled. A few passengers were still shaken, but the panic had begun to fade. Sonia moved down the aisle, scanning each row with sharp, assessing eyes. She stopped beside a middle-aged woman, her breathing still shallow, fingers gripping the armrest with white-knuckled tension. Beside her, her husband gently rubbed her back, murmuring reassurances. "It's all right," Sonia said softly, offering a small, steady smile. "We're descending. We're safe now." But just as calm started to settle, a cold, sharp voice sliced through the cockpit. "What the hell do you think you just did?" Walter looked up. Matthew was staring at him, eyes burning with accusation. "I just kept this plane out of danger," Walter said evenly. Matthew let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You trying to play hero? You took it upon yourself to descend without the captain's order." Walter took a slow breath, steadying himself. "If I hadn't, we could have lost lives." Matthew's eyes narrowed. "Oh, really? And now you think you're the savior of this flight?" He leaned forward, voice edged with mockery. "Let me make this clear. If anyone asks, I'll report that you panicked, that you overreacted." Walter stilled. He had expected this, and yet the quiet rage still simmered beneath his skin. Even after averting a disaster, he still had to fight for the truth. "You're really willing to do that?" Walter met Matthew's gaze head-on. "Even knowing that I did the right thing?" Matthew leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. "Who do you think they'll believe? A captain with 25 years in the cockpit? Or a first officer just waiting for his shot?" Walter clenched his fists, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he inhaled deeply, then let it go. He knew the truth didn't need to be shouted. It would prove itself. Through the internal radio, Sonia's voice came through, calm but firm. "Cockpit, the situation in the cabin is stable now. I just wanted to thank whoever made the right call." Matthew's gaze flicked to the instrument panel, then out the window. Below them, the vast ocean stretched endlessly, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the setting sun. And somewhere deep inside, whether he would admit it or not, Matthew knew Walter had been right. But pride was a heavy thing, and it wouldn't let him say it. Walter didn't need the recognition. He didn't need gratitude. He needed only one thing, the truth. And the truth would speak for itself. Houston International Airport, 1942. The Boeing 737-900 rolled slowly along the tarmac, finally coming to a halt in the designated emergency landing zone. As the engines powered down, Walter Dean removed his headset and leaned back against his seat, feeling the rapid thump of his heartbeat still echoing in his chest. He glanced at the passenger cabin through the internal camera feed. Oxygen masks still dangled from the ceiling. A few passengers spoke quietly with the flight attendants, some still visibly shaken, but gradually regaining composure. "We got them down safely," he exhaled. But another concern was already forming in his mind. Beside him, Matthew Nuth sat in silence, staring at the control panel, as if weighing his next move. Then, without warning, Matthew unbuckled his harness and shot to his feet. Without a single word, he strode out of the cockpit and off the aircraft. Walter frowned. He didn't need to guess where Matthew was headed. Matthew was already there, speaking to a group of airline representatives and maintenance personnel. His voice was low, but carried the weight of authority. There was no real threat. A minor systems issue, nothing critical. The first officer overreacted and initiated an unsanctioned descent without my authorization. Several heads nodded. Notes were scribbled down. Walter stepped forward just in time to hear it all. He stopped, anger tightening in his chest. Overreacted? His voice was calm, but edged with steel. Matthew turned to face him, unflinching. You acted on your own, Walter. There was no definitive proof that we were in real danger. Walter narrowed his eyes, forcing himself to stay composed. You mean to say the cabin pressure warnings were imaginary? The passengers panicking was just for show? Or maybe the person who passed out mid-flight wasn't a real cause for concern? Matthew folded his arms, his smirk cold. I've been flying for over 25 years. I know the difference between a real emergency and a minor glitch. Walter clenched his fists at his sides. He knew that arguing now would only play into Matthew's hands. Before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. Walter Dean, Director Parker wants to see you. Walter stepped inside. Across the table sat Alan Parker, the CEO of Skyway Airlines. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. Sit, Parker instructed, his tone devoid of warmth. Walter took a seat, facing him. Parker placed a folder on the table and slid it forward. Matthew's report. I've received the captain's statement. Parker's gaze didn't waver. What do you have to say for yourself? Walter lifted his head, meeting Parker's eyes. This moment could decide his entire career. The air in the executive boardroom was razor-sharp with tension. Walter Dean sat upright in his chair, facing Alan Parker, the CEO of Skyway Airlines. In front of Parker lay a thick report, its cover marked with bold, unforgiving letters. Incident report, Skyway Flight 227. Walter didn't need to open it. He knew exactly what was inside. Matthew Nuth's official statement, accusing him of reckless decision-making, of endangering the flight with an unnecessary descent. Parker tapped his fingers lightly on the polished wooden table, his gaze piercing. Captain Nuss has reported that you unilaterally initiated a descent without his authorization, Parker said coolly. He claims your reaction was excessive and unwarranted. What do you have to say for yourself? Walter held his ground, his voice steady. I did what was necessary to protect the passengers and crew. Parker's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the report. The captain claims there was no real danger, that the system experienced a minor malfunction, but you overreacted, causing unnecessary panic. Do you deny that? Walter curled his fingers slightly against his lap, but kept his expression unreadable. If there was no real danger, then why did a passenger lose consciousness? Why were others struggling to breathe? His voice sharpened as he leaned in slightly. If I hadn't descended, we might have lost a life. A thick silence settled over the room. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, suddenly, the door swung open. Sonia Grant stepped inside, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. She walked straight to the table, standing tall before Parker. Parker glanced at his watch, then gave a curt nod. Ms. Grant, you were on that flight. I'd like to hear from the lead flight attendant. Sonia cast a brief glance at Walter before turning to Parker. Her voice was clear and unwavering. One of our passengers lost consciousness due to oxygen deprivation. Several others struggled to breathe. If we hadn't descended, the situation could have been far worse. Parker nodded slowly, considering. So, in your opinion, First Officer Dean's decision was justified? Sonia didn't hesitate, not even for a second. It wasn't just justified. It was the only choice. The weight of her words sliced through the tension in the room. Parker remained silent for a long moment before flipping another page in the report. But Captain Nuss insists he had the situation under control without the need for dissent, he said, his gaze unwavering. Why, then? Do you and he have entirely different assessments of the same event? Sonia leaned in slightly, her expression sharp. I can't answer for him, she said evenly. But if you ask me, I think he simply doesn't want to admit he was wrong. For the first time, Parker's brows lifted slightly, surprise flickering across his otherwise impassive face. He turned back to Walter, his voice measured, deliberate. You're suggesting Captain Nuts had a personal motive in his report? Walter didn't flinch. I'm not suggesting, he said. I'm stating it outright. His gaze was unshaken. Captain Nuts ignored a safety warning. He wants to make me the scapegoat to protect his own reputation. Silence swallowed the room. Parker leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the table. That's a serious accusation, he said. Do you have evidence? Walter tightened his grip slightly, but kept his voice calm, unwavering. I don't have a video recording. I don't have an audio log. He exhaled slowly. But I do have a cabin full of passengers who lived through it. And I have Chief Flight Attendant Grant, who saw everything firsthand. Parker let out a slow breath, his gaze sharp and calculating. This wasn't just an evaluation anymore. This was a battle of truth and power. Finally, he closed the report and folded his hands over it. His voice was low, thoughtful. I'll need time to review this. His eyes locked onto Walter's. You're dismissed. Walter rose from his seat. As he turned to leave, his gaze briefly met Sonia's. They both knew this wasn't over. Walter Dean walked down the long corridor leading to the crew lounge, his steps slow, his chest heavy. Alan Parker's last words echoed in his mind. I need time to review this. A polite response, maybe even a meaningless one. In the airline industry, when a first officer was accused of misconduct by a veteran captain, the odds of a fair investigation were slim to none. Walter wasn't naive enough to believe otherwise. Beside him, Sonia walked in silence. There was no need for words between them. They had fought for the truth. But the truth, it seemed, wasn't always enough. As they neared the crew lounge, a familiar figure stood leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Matthew Nuffs. His face was calm, too calm, not tense, not uncertain. Instead, it carried a quiet smugness, the look of a man who already knew how the story would end. Walter's jaw tightened as he came to a stop. Matthew pushed off the wall and took a few slow steps toward them. Then, with the faintest smirk, he spoke. You put up a good fight, Dean, but you do know how this is going to end, don't you? Walter let out a quiet breath, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze never wavered. And what exactly is that, Matthew? The airline isn't going to let this become a scandal, Matthew said, his voice measured, confident. They might give you a slap on the wrist, maybe a temporary suspension. But you know what? He tilted his head, lowering his voice. No one wants to make a big deal out of something this small. Walter felt the anger rise inside him, but he refused to let it take control. Instead, he stepped closer, his stare cutting through Matthew's facade. Something small? His voice was low, steady. You're talking about a situation that could have killed passengers. About a call I made to save them. About how you ignored safety warnings just to protect your own ego. Matthew raised an eyebrow, then shrugged as if the weight of it all meant nothing. You can think whatever you want, but what you think doesn't matter. What matters is who gets to decide. His smirk widened slightly. And I'm afraid you don't have the advantage here. Walter clenched his fists, but he refused to engage in Matthew's game. You're right about one thing, Matthew. He leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but unshakable. I don't have the advantage. A beat of silence. But I have the truth. And sooner or later, the truth speaks for itself. For the first time, Matthew hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. But the smirk never fully faded. We'll see about that. And with that, he turned and walked away, his strides firm, confident, like a man who believed the outcome was already written. Walter watched him go, then exhaled slowly, forcing down the storm inside him. He had been right. Sonia knew it. Matthew knew it. But in a system that had never been on his side, being right wasn't enough. He was standing at the edge of a cliff. Either he found a way forward, or everything he had built over the past 10 years in aviation would be wiped away. Then his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A text from an unknown number. If you need proof, meet me at the cafe across from the airport. 20 minutes. Walter narrowed his eyes, cautious. A part of him told him to ignore it. Too much had happened. He knew better than anyone that traps were everywhere. But if there was even a chance, he couldn't let it slip away. He turned to Sonia, his voice calm but resolute. I could be walking into a trap, he said, or I might have just found the only way to save everything. The small cafe across from Houston Airport was nearly empty at this hour. Soft golden light pooled over wooden tables, casting long shadows, serene, yet laced with an air of quiet intrigue. Walter pushed open the door, his gaze sweeping across the room in a practiced scan. He didn't know exactly who he was looking for, but something in his gut told him this moment was a turning point. In the farthest corner, a man in a dark leather jacket and a low-brimmed cap sat alone by the window. As Walter approached, the man lifted his head slightly, meeting his eyes for just a second before offering a subtle nod. Walter took the seat across from him. "I'm guessing you're the one who texted me?" His tone was calm, measured. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small USB drive, and set it on the table between them. "This contains the cockpit voice recording from Skyway Flight 227, he said, his voice low and steady. "I figured you'd want to hear it." Walter's breath hitched just slightly, his eyes locked onto the tiny device, small, unassuming, but powerful enough to change everything. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his gaze sharp. The man smirked faintly, as if expecting the question. "I work in the technical operations department. I have access to flight data." He leaned in slightly, his next words deliberate. "And I listened to the recording myself." A pause. Then, with quiet certainty, "I know you were telling the truth." Walter's pulse quickened. "You could have sent this directly to the airline," he said carefully. "Why bring it to me?" The man propped an elbow on the table, leveling Walter with a knowing look. "What do you think the airline would do if they got it first? Conduct a fair investigation?" He scoffed. "You're too smart for that, Dean." Walter pressed his lips together. The man was right. If this evidence landed in the airline's hands before Walter had a chance to use it, it could be edited, buried, or conveniently lost. But if he had it first, he could control the narrative. Slowly, he reached out and took the USB. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I don't want anything." His voice was quiet but firm. "I've just seen too many cases like this. And I know someone like you." He paused, then smirked. "Won't let it go." Walter studied him for a beat, then gave a small nod. "Thank you." The man let out a faint chuckle, then stood, pulling his cap lower over his eyes. Without another word, he turned and walked out, disappearing into the night. Walter sat there for a long moment, the USB clenched tightly in his hand. For the first time in hours, after battling doubt, injustice, and forces larger than himself, he felt something shift, a spark of hope. He had a chance. Now it was up to him what he did with it. Walter Dean didn't blink as he stared at the screen in front of him. Flight SKW 319, Los Angeles, LAX, New York JFK. Crew, Captain Matthew Nuths, First Officer Walter Dean. His lips pressed into a thin line, a weight settling in his chest like a stone. This wasn't just another routine flight. In the first-class cabin sat some of Skyway Airlines' biggest investors, the people who held the company's future in their hands. Even the smallest mistake could cost millions, ripple through thousands of jobs. For Walter, this was more than a high-stakes flight. It was a chance to prove himself, to silence the doubts that had followed him for weeks. A flawless performance here could show the world that he was more than capable of earning his captain's seat. But Matthew Nuths was the captain. Walter leaned back in his chair, his breath slowing. He had hoped never to fly with Matthew again. Yet here they were, fate forcing them into the same cockpit, on a flight that could change everything. "Walter?" Sonia Grant's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see her standing near the operations desk, a flight folder in her hands. Her sharp eyes flicked to the screen, then back to him. She didn't need to ask. She already understood. "Matthew again." Her voice was calm, but heavy with meaning. Walter gave a slow nod, his jaw tightening. Sonia set the folder down, leaning in slightly. Her voice dropped, firm yet steady. "This is your chance, Walter. Don't let him shake you." Walter inhaled deeply. He could feel the silent strength in her words, the unspoken support. He couldn't back down. Not now. Flight crew briefing room. The room was silent except for the occasional tap of a pen against the table. Walter stepped inside, his eyes immediately locking onto Matthew. The captain sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, detached. Across from them, a flight coordinator reviewed the flight plan. Today's route is straightforward, the coordinator began. Weather conditions are stable across most of the flight path, though there's a minor turbulence zone off the East Coast. Nothing major, but the weather radar will need close monitoring. Walter nodded, quickly making a note. Can we run an additional radar check before takeoff? I want to make sure it's fully optimized before we enter any turbulence. Matthew exhaled sharply, snapping his folder shut. Everything's already been checked per protocol, Dean. He leaned back in his chair, his tone laced with condescension. I don't need a first officer playing genius. Just sit tight and do your job. Walter felt his temple pulse, but he kept his voice even. I'm just ensuring the safety of this flight. That's never a bad thing. Matthew smirked. You ensuring safety? His tone was mocking. Let's not forget who the captain is here. The air in the room grew heavier. From the corner, Sonia watched the exchange, saying nothing, but Walter knew she was quietly concerned. He took a deep breath, set his pen down. No need to argue. Everything would be decided in the air. Runway 24L, LAX. The engines roared as the Boeing 737-900 taxied into position. Walter kept his focus on the instruments, systematically verifying every reading as Matthew pushed the throttles forward. 140 knots. V1. Rotate. The nose lifted. The aircraft climbed into the endless blue sky. Walter's fingers hovered over the radar display, his mind trained on every flicker of data. Then, something felt off. A blip appeared in the corner of the screen. Small, fleeting, then gone. A glitch? Or something more? You keep staring at that radar like it's going to tell you your future, Matthew scoffed, his voice dripping with amusement. It's fine. Walter clenched his jaw but said nothing. The unease in his chest didn't fade. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe... He shifted his gaze to the sky ahead, where thick white clouds stretched endlessly into the horizon. The flight had just begun, but the real turbulence had yet to reveal itself. The Boeing 737-900 sliced through the night, leaving the glittering city lights far below. At cruising altitude, everything seemed smooth, but Walter didn't feel at ease. His eyes stayed locked on the weather radar, where strange flickers of interference kept appearing and vanishing. The turbulence zones along their route weren't as stable as forecasted. Matthew, I think we have a radar issue, Walter said, his voice measured. The weather data isn't consistent. Matthew glanced at the screen briefly before looking away, unimpressed. It's nothing. Radars glitch sometimes. No big deal. Walter frowned. We're approaching an area of unstable air. I think we should verify everything before we go any further. Matthew exhaled sharply, his irritation bleeding through. Walter, this is why you're not a captain yet. He turned to face him, eyes sharp with condescension. You second-guess everything. You hesitate. You need to trust your experience. Walter didn't answer. There was no point in arguing, but the unease in his gut deepened. 10 minutes later, the sky ahead darkened. Thick clouds formed rapidly, lightning flickering in the distance, stronger than expected. Walter glanced at the radar again. The storm was bigger than what they had been briefed on. He straightened in his seat. His voice dropped slightly. We should reroute. Avoid the storm center. Matthew smirked, shaking his head. No need. If it's not a full-scale storm, we can fly through it and stay on schedule. What's the matter? Getting scared? Walter's throat went dry. Are you sure about this? If the winds are stronger than expected, Matthew let out a low chuckle, full of mockery. You think I've never flown through a storm before? This isn't my first time, Dean. Walter clenched his jaw. He knew Matthew was gambling. And this time, the price wasn't just his pride, it was hundreds of lives. Passenger cabin, 35,000 feet. Sonia could feel the shift. Her smile remained professional, but she sensed the growing unease in the cabin. A man near the window frowned, staring outside. The plane's shaking more, a woman murmured. Sonia kept her voice calm. Just light turbulence, ma'am. Everything is under control. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. Then, without warning, A powerful crosswind slammed into the aircraft. The turbulence alert blared. The plane lurched violently to the side, passengers screaming as drinks spilled and overhead bins rattled. Cockpit, chaos unfolds. "Damn it," Matthew hissed, gripping the controls. The aircraft shuddered, wind shear throwing it off course. Walter's eyes flew to the instruments. Wind speeds far exceeded the forecast. He turned sharply toward Matthew, voice urgent but controlled. "We need to change course now. If we don't, we could get caught in a wind vortex." Matthew's knuckles whitened on the controls, sweat beading on his forehead. "I've got this," he snapped, but his hands trembled. Walter's blood turned to ice. Matthew was losing control. A violent air pocket sent the plane plunging, 500 feet in seconds. Screams filled the cabin. In first class, a man gripped his seat, his eyes wide with terror. Alarms blared. Walter knew he couldn't wait any longer. He tightened his grip on the controls, heart pounding. It was time to do what he had never done before. Take command. The warning alarm screamed through the cockpit, red lights flashing in rapid succession across the control panel. The aircraft trembled violently, tossed around like a fragile leaf caught in a storm's fury. Walter gripped the yoke tightly, his eyes locked onto the instrument readings. 34,000 feet, 32,500, 31,000. They were losing altitude fast. He turned to Matthew. The captain's face was tense, sweat beading on his forehead. His grip on the controls was ironclad, but his frantic adjustments weren't helping. The plane continued to drop, the violent air currents slamming against it, threatening to tear it apart. "We need to change course now," Walter urged, keeping his voice steady. "If we don't, we'll be pulled into an even stronger wind vortex." Matthew gritted his teeth, his hands clenched around the yoke as if it were the only thing keeping them alive. "I have it under control," he snapped. But the numbers on the screen told a different story. Walter realized it then. This wasn't just a worsening situation. Matthew was losing control. A brutal gust of wind slammed into them, tilting the aircraft hard to the side. 30,500 feet, 29,800. Screams erupted from the cabin. The oxygen masks shuddered in their compartments, seconds away from deploying. In first class, a silver-haired businessman clutched his armrest, his face drained of color. Sonia struggled to keep the passengers calm, but even she could feel the sinking weight of fear clawing at her chest. This time, there were no reassurances. For the first time, there was no guarantee they would make it down in one piece. Walter's gaze flicked to Matthew's hands. He was still gripping the controls, but his fingers were shaking. A captain with 25 years of experience didn't shake unless he was losing the fight. Walter's pulse pounded in his ears. He had to act. "Matthew, let go of the controls." His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful, but it commanded attention. Matthew's head snapped toward him, his eyes flashing with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Walter held his gaze unwavering. "Saving this plane," he said, his voice calm, steady. "If you can't do it, I will." For a moment, neither of them moved. The plane continued to shudder. The alarms kept blaring. The passengers kept screaming. Matthew's jaw clenched, his pride warring with reality. Then his hands slowly loosened. He let go. Walter didn't hesitate. He seized the controls. Step 1. Reduce speed. He eased the throttles back slightly, cutting down the thrust to minimize the impact of the wind shear. Step 2. Adjust course. He tilted the yoke to the left, angling the aircraft away from the turbulence rather than forcing through it. Step 3. Stabilize. He pulled the nose up gently, locking in at 28,500 feet, giving the aircraft time to recover. The first few seconds, the plane still fought back, jerking violently in protest. Then, the shaking slowed. The radar flickered, its signal clearing. One by one, the warning alarms faded. The red lights on the control panel dimmed. They had broken free. The chaos inside the cabin settled. The screams softened into ragged breaths. A woman near the window exhaled shakily, her fingers finally releasing the death grip on her armrest. Up front, Sonia let out a quiet breath. her hand still gripping the back of a seat. She didn't need to ask. She knew exactly who had really flown that plane. Cockpit silence. Walter slowly released the controls, his entire body taut with the remnants of adrenaline. Beside him, Matthew remained rigid in his seat, staring blankly at the instruments. He didn't look at Walter. He didn't say a word. There was no acknowledgement, no gratitude, but Walter didn't need it. The truth had already spoken for itself. The Boeing 737-900 glided smoothly through the sky, leaving behind the storm that had nearly swallowed it whole. Beyond the cockpit windows, the first golden rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the aircraft's wings. Inside the cockpit, silence reigned. Walter Dean slowly loosened his grip on the controls, his pulse still steadying after the chaos of the past few minutes. They had made it out. The plane was safe, but the weight of what had just happened still hung heavy in the air. He turned slightly, glancing at Matthew. The captain sat motionless, his eyes locked onto the control panel, hands resting limply on his thighs. There was no acknowledgement, no gratitude, just the cold, bitter realization that he had not been the one to save this flight. Walter didn't need a thank you. He turned back to his instruments, keeping his focus where it belonged, on flying the plane. He had done his job, and that was enough. First class cabin. The passengers were settling, though the aftershock of fear still lingered in their expressions. Sonia Grant stood near the front, her sharp eyes sweeping across the cabin. Then, a distinguished-looking man in a gray suit rose from his seat and stepped forward. Richard Cole, one of Skyway Airlines' most influential investors. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sonia hesitated briefly before nodding. She turned toward the cockpit and knocked lightly. The door opened. Both Walter and Matthew turned, but Richard Cole's eyes were fixed on only one of them. He extended his hand. "Thank you, First Officer Dean. You handled that situation exceptionally well." The words rang through the small space, undeniable. Walter blinked, then took the man's hand with professional composure. "Just doing my duty, sir." Richard Cole gave a knowing smile. "Your duty?" he echoed. "No. I've been on enough flights to recognize when a pilot is doing more than what's required." His gaze flicked to Matthew, sharp and assessing. "And I also know when someone isn't doing their job." Matthew's jaw tensed. Walter didn't need to look at him to feel the anger simmering beneath his silence. But this time, there was no way to deny the truth. JFK International Airport, Skyway Airlines headquarters. A team of executives was already waiting when the plane landed. Alan Parker, the CEO of Skyway Airlines, stood at the forefront, his expression unreadable. "I need both of you in the conference room. Now." Walter wasn't surprised. He had known there would be consequences. Inside the boardroom, Matthew sat stiffly, his usual arrogance noticeably subdued. He knew, just as Walter did, that there was no spinning what had happened in the air. Alan Parker placed both hands on the table, his gaze first landing on Matthew. "Captain Nuths, I've received reports from flight operations, and I've spoken to some of our very important passengers on board." He let the weight of his words settle. They all have the same question. Why was the first officer the one handling the emergency, while the captain seemed to have lost control? Matthew remained silent. Parker didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned to Walter, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Dean, if you had been the captain, what would you have done differently?" Walter took a steady breath. This was it, another test. He met Parker's gaze without hesitation. "I would have taken action earlier to avoid the weather system. I would have listened to my first officer instead of dismissing their concerns. And most importantly," his voice remained firm, unshaken, "I would never have let my ego compromise the safety of my crew and passengers." Silence blanketed the room. Alan Parker studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod. "In that case," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, "I believe it's time this airline gets a new captain." The next morning, an official announcement from Skyway Airlines was sent to all employees. The news spread like wildfire, from the executive offices to the crew lounges, from veteran pilots to the newest recruits. Walter Dean had been officially promoted to captain. For those who had been aboard flight SKW-319, the decision came as no surprise. They had seen, firsthand, how he had seized control of the aircraft at the worst possible moment, how he had adjusted every parameter, faced down a captain who had lost his way, and brought the passengers to safety. But what truly stirred whispers across the airline was the fate of Matthew Nuths. According to the announcement, Matthew had been reassigned to the pilot training division, permanently removed from commercial flights. It was the airline's way of handling the matter as smoothly as possible, a demotion without calling it one. But everyone understood the truth. His career had ended the moment Walter took the controls on that fateful flight. The crew lounge buzzed with an unusual energy. Conversations broke out in hushed and animated tones. Some wholeheartedly supported Walter, believing he had deserved the position long ago. Others, while not opposed, remained wary, for change always carried a shadow of doubt. Meanwhile, aviation forums lit up with discussions about SKW-319. Industry articles hailed Walter as a model of skill and composure. Others, less forgiving, openly criticized Matthew, calling him stubborn and inflexible, suggesting that it was his own ego that had led to his downfall. In the pilot's lounge, Matthew stepped inside, feeling the shift in the air the moment he crossed the threshold. He carried himself the same way he always had, shoulders squared, strides firm. But it could not change the reality that the eyes around him no longer looked at him the same way. Once, when he entered a room, conversations would pause in greeting. Pilots would gather to discuss flights, exchange experiences, seek his advice. But now, the respect was gone. Former colleagues offered nothing more than a curt nod as he walked past, as if unsure what to say. No one lingered. No one approached him for counsel. As he passed a group of younger pilots, he caught a murmur just within earshot. Walter Dean should have been captain long ago. Then another voice, quieter but just as cutting. And Nuths, who would have thought he'd lose control like that? Matthew's hand clenched at his side, but he did not turn around. There was nothing to defend, because he knew it was the truth. Not long after, Walter walked in. There was no arrogance in his steps, no satisfaction in his expression. He simply headed toward the coffee counter, poured himself a cup, and took a seat by the window, his usual spot, where he liked to watch the runway. A senior captain approached, resting a firm hand on his shoulder. "You did what not everyone would have had the courage to do, Walter." Walter turned and recognized Robert Mitchell, a veteran captain he had long admired. "I only did my duty, sir." Mitchell nodded, approval gleaming in his eyes. "Good, because from today on, that's no longer the duty of a first officer. It's the duty of a captain." Walter smiled, bowing his head in quiet gratitude. No grand celebration, no elaborate speeches, no framed certificates or glowing headlines. Because this moment, when his peers looked at him with true respect, was the recognition he had been waiting for all these years. 3 days later, 3 days after the airline's official announcement, Walter received a summons from the executive office to finalize his promotion. He had known this moment was coming, but as he stood before the towering wooden doors leading to Alan Parker's office, an invisible weight settled on his shoulders. The last time he had walked through this door, it was to defend himself, to justify his decision to descend altitude and save flight SKW-319. Back then, he had known that one wrong word, one misstep, could have led to his suspension, or worse, his removal from Skyway Airlines. But today was different. He took a deep breath and knocked. Inside, Alan Parker sat in his usual place behind a massive wooden desk. A neatly stacked file lay in front of him. As Walter stepped in, Parker looked up. His gaze was as sharp as ever, but this time, there was something else in it. Something undeniable. Recognition. "Have a seat, Dean," Parker said, his voice steady. Walter pulled out a chair, keeping his posture straight. Parker opened the file, flipping through a few pages before meeting his gaze. "I'll get straight to the point. Your promotion has been officially approved. As of today, you are a captain of Skyway Airlines." Walter nodded, his tone unwavering. "Thank you, sir. I won't let the airline down." Parker's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I know you won't. If I had any doubts, I wouldn't have signed this. He slid the file across the desk, motioning toward the signature line. The words Captain Walter Dean printed boldly above it. Walter picked up the pen and signed. As the final strokes settled into the paper, Parker leaned back in his chair, studying him for a long moment before speaking. Do you know what's most interesting about this decision, Dean? Walter looked up, waiting. 4 months ago, when your name came up for consideration, I barely gave it a second thought. Not because you weren't good enough, but because I believed that if we already had a capable captain, there was no need to make a change. He paused, his gaze turning razor sharp. But now I realize my mistake. A captain isn't just someone with technical expertise. A captain knows when to stand up, even if it means standing against a superior. Walter remained silent, absorbing every word. Parker raised an eyebrow. Do you regret going against Matthew on that flight? Walter's response was immediate. No. Parker nodded slowly. Good. Because that is exactly why you deserve this position. He stood up, extending his hand. Walter rose as well, grasping it firmly. As Walter turned to leave, Parker added one last thing. A word of advice, Dean. When you put on that captain's uniform, you won't just be a pilot. He paused. You'll be a symbol. Walter allowed himself the slightest smile. I understand. As he stepped out of the office, something had shifted. He was no longer First Officer Walter Dean. He was Captain Walter Dean. The final conversation. Walter was making his way out of the executive offices when he spotted a familiar figure standing by the hallway window. Matthew Nuths. The former captain stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the runway, where a Boeing 737 was preparing for takeoff. He didn't turn immediately, but Walter knew. He had sensed his presence. Walter stopped a few steps away, waiting. Finally, Matthew spoke, his voice quieter than usual. There was no sharpness, no authority, just a quiet resignation. You got what you wanted, Dean. Walter didn't react right away. He knew those words weren't spoken in resentment. They were simply an acknowledgement. No, he said evenly. I never wanted anything except to do what was right. Matthew let out a soft chuckle. Though whether it was bitter or self-deprecating, Walter couldn't tell. He turned at last, facing Walter directly. The arrogance, the dominance that once radiated from him had faded. In its place was something else, something more human. Do you think I was wrong? Matthew asked. But before Walter could answer, he shook his head. Never mind. I already know what you think. Walter remained silent. Matthew exhaled, his gaze drifting back to the runway. I've been flying for 25 years. I've watched generations of younger pilots come and go, but you were the first to truly challenge me. Walter raised an eyebrow. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Matthew smirked. I haven't decided yet. A long pause settled between them. Outside, airplanes continued their steady ascent, climbing into the vast, open sky. At last, Matthew met Walter's eyes one final time. Then, with a slow nod, he said, Good luck, Dean. He turned and walked away, his steps unhurried but steady. Walter watched him go. Matthew never said the words outright, but Walter knew that was his acknowledgement. He took a deep breath, the air feeling clearer than it had in a long time. Tomorrow, he would put on his captain's uniform for the first time. But the sky remained the same. Only now, he would be the one leading the way. The next morning, Walter Dean stood before the mirror in the crew locker room. The uniform on his body was one he had worn countless times before, yet today, one detail made all the difference. On his shoulders, 3 golden stripes and 1 white. The insignia of a captain. He took a deep breath, adjusting his collar before carefully fastening the cuffs of his sleeves. For 12 years, he had worn different variations of this uniform, first as a junior pilot, then as a first officer. But today, it carried an entirely new weight. He was no longer a supporter. He was the one leading the way. Walter shut his locker, picked up his captain's hat, and stepped out. When he walked into the crew briefing room, every pair of eyes turned to him. But this time, there was no doubt, no hesitation, only recognition. Sonia Grant, clad in her chief flight attendant uniform, was the first to break the silence. Looks good on you, Captain Dean, she said, a flicker of pride in her gaze. Walter offered a small smile. "Thank you, Chief Purser Grant." A few pilots nodded in greeting. Some stepped forward to shake his hand. Even those who had once been uncertain could no longer deny the truth. Walter had earned his place. Alan Parker had been right. This uniform wasn't just a title. It was responsibility. It was a symbol. Sonia handed him the day's schedule. SKW 205, New York to Chicago. Your first flight as captain. I have the honor of flying with you today. Walter glanced over the itinerary, then gave a firm nod. Then let's take off. The Boeing 737-900 stood ready on the runway. Walter settled into the captain's seat, feeling a strange mix of familiarity and newness. Beside him sat his first officer, Ethan Carter, a young, eager pilot who had recently been promoted himself. Ethan studied Walter for a moment before offering a small grin. "I've heard a lot about you, Captain Dean." Walter met his gaze, his voice steady. "Let's hope you won't be disappointed." Everything was set. Walter placed his hands on the controls, feeling the subtle hum of the engines beneath his fingertips. Outside, the runway stretched ahead, bathed in the golden light of morning. Ethan read out the final takeoff parameters. Walter registered every word, but deep inside, he had only one thought. This was the moment he had waited for his entire career. He drew in a breath, then gave the order with quiet certainty. "Take off." The engines roared to life. The aircraft surged forward, wheels lifting from the ground, rising into the endless sky. Walter Dean was officially a captain, and this was only the beginning. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He had weathered the storm, and now he commanded the skies on his own terms. Not to prove anything, not to compete with anyone, just to do his job, because now the sky was his. Walter Dean's story is not merely the journey of a pilot. It is a testament to perseverance, resilience, and the unyielding spirit to rise above adversity. In life, many find themselves trapped beneath the weight of prejudice, doubt, and obstacles that stand between them and their dreams. But like Walter, one must never allow those barriers to define who they are. Believe in your own strength. Hold fast to your professionalism. Dare to stand tall when the moment demands it. Never stop learning. True success is not born from fleeting recognition, but from the undeniable worth of what you bring to the world. A turbulent flight, a life-changing decision, and a long overdue recognition. But is this truly the end of Walter's fight, or just the beginning? Comment your thoughts and subscribe for more inspiring stories.